As you're aware, APA formatting is known for being notoriously detailed-oriented. So I spent the last week compiling all of my lessons on APA formatting into this mega tutorial that's probably equally detailed-oriented. But what you should know is I have this free PDF download that you can get from the link in the description below. And also this video is quite long, so do note that it is structured as the categories are appearing on the screen right now. And you can use the timestamps to skip ahead if there's something specific you're looking for. Everyone else, let's jump into section 1 where we're going to discuss general formatting and your paper setup. So the way this tutorial is going to work is that we have the completed paper on the left-hand side of the screen, and we're going to be building out the APA formatting on the right. So what we're going to start with is our general formatting, starting with our margins. So per APA formatting, your entire paper should have a 1-inch margin around all 4 sides. The good news is that this is the default setting in Microsoft Word. If you want to verify that, come up here to the rule bar, go to layout, and then you can see margins here, the drop down, it is automatically on normal. Where the first official general formatting we're going to set is our line spacing. So our entire document needs to be double spaced. To set this, you're going to again come up here to the rule bar, go to paragraph, select line spacing options, in which it's as simple as hitting 2.0. Now do be sure to go back and make sure that if the remove space after paragraph is showing, you want to go ahead and click that so there's no extra lines when you hit enter throughout your document. The next thing you're going to do is add a page number to your title page. My favorite way to do this is go ahead and double click in the header window. As you can see, that just populated our option to edit, in which we have our page number drop-down menu right here. You want to make sure to select top of page and then add the page number in the right-hand corner like you see it is there. Now, before we click out, we're not quite finished. You want to make sure to highlight that number so that way you can change the font size and type to match the rest of your document. We're going to change this to Times New Roman 12 point, because that tends to be the universally accepted font size and type for APA formatting. Once that's finished, it's as simple as double clicking anywhere on your paper, and now you can see our page number is set. Speaking of font, let's go ahead and set that up for the rest of our document. To do so, you want to select the font drop-down menu here in our rule bar, go ahead and change Calibri to Times New Roman, and we're going to set it at a size 12. But that officially concludes the general formatting, in which now we can move on to typing out the elements on our title page. The first thing you want to do is center your cursor, come up here to paragraph, select the centering option, and then I recommend hitting enter roughly 5 or 6 times to bring your cursor down to the middle of your paper. From there, you're going to start by typing out the title. As you can see, it is in boldface font, so you can come up to Font, select bold. A shortcut is also hitting Command B or Control B, depending on if you're using a Mac or a PC. I'm going to go ahead and paste in our title right here. As a rule of thumb, a good title is a handful of keywords that captures the essence of your paper. If you want to include a subtitle, go ahead and type it out directly below your main title like you see it is there. Although we don't have one, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that, in which now we're going to move on to including our name. So to include your name element, you want to hit enter twice, so 1, 2, and then you're going to type out your name like you see it is here on the left, where it's the first name, middle initial, followed by our last name. Now do note that the font is no longer bolded, as it won't be for the rest of the elements on our title page. The next element you want to include is your affiliation line. And so this is going to be composed of 2 different things. First, your department, and 2, your university. The department might sound a little confusing, but it's simply the department in which you're getting your degree under. So I got a business degree, therefore mine is the Department of Business, and then my university was John F. Kennedy University. Next, you want to include your course information. This also is composed of 2 different things. It's going to be your course code, followed by a colon, and then the name of your course. If you're not sure what the course code is, you can usually find it physically on the outside of the door, or if you're taking online classes, in your syllabus or somewhere in your online portal. Next up, you want to include your professor's name. And so my only note here is that you want to follow the same naming convention that they use to refer to themselves. So if it's doctor, professor, PhD, however they type out their name in your course material is exactly how you want to include it on your paper. And that leads us right into the final element for our title page, which is the due date for your assignment. For this, you simply want to format it the way that you would format a date in the country you live in. But with that, our title page is good to go. Now let's move on to formatting the main body and the reference list. And the easiest thing that I recommend doing is you want to insert a page break directly after the last element on your title page. And so to do that, make sure your cursor is flush against the last portion of that. Go up here to Insert, select Pages, and then Insert Page Break. What that's going to do is that brings your cursor to the top of your second page. This is going to freeze the formatting on the title page and make your life super easy. So from here, we're going to actually copy our title and paste that here at the top because that's going to signify the introduction starting our main body. Per APA 7th edition, they no longer want you to type out the word introduction. So with that, we're now ready to start writing the main body in our paper. Now from here, I recommend repeating this process and inserting another page break to format your reference list. So again, bring your cursor flush to the end of that title. Go to Pages, insert Page Break, and then now we can title our reference list with the phrase References. Do note how it's centered and bolded as this is APA's standard for starting your reference list. So you can understand why I recommend setting in the page breaks. For example, let's go back to our main body. And let's add some of the content for our paper. So we've started writing. Coming back down to our reference list, notice how it's frozen in place. That way your reference list is always going to be on the last page, so you're free to add, edit references as you're typing out your paper. Now we're not quite finished with the formatting for our reference page. The next thing you want to do is set the hanging indent. And so the first thing is you want to bring your cursor back over to the left-hand side of your screen. And then from there, using the line spacing drop-down menu, you want to select line spacing options. Here, you will see the indentation features in the center in which you want to select special, change it from none to hanging, and then ensure that it's hanging by 0.5 inch. From there, select OK, and then now your hanging indent should be set. So just to put this to the test, here I am typing out a full reference list entry. As you can see, when I fill up that first entire line and my cursor goes to the next, it is indented inward that 1/2 inch, which is per APA standards. Now, before we move on, I do have one other life-saving trick I'd like to show you. So while our hanging indent is set for our paper, if you were to copy and paste a reference from somewhere else, the formatting might be a little off. And so it's important to know how to fix this. The easiest way to do this is you would highlight that reference and then use the ruler to set the hanging indent. Notice my cursor is hovering over that middle caret for the hanging indent. If I hold that and drag it in, that 1/2 inch, there we go, my hanging indent is fixed. Now that's going to be it for our general formatting. The next thing we're going to talk about is using section headings. And now before you skip ahead, please watch this section of the video because it's actually what's going to make your life easier as an academic writer. So simply put, section headings are what you use to organize your papers. And under APA 7th edition, there are 5 levels. Those 5 levels are formatted like you see here on the screen. You're welcome to pause, take a screenshot, or download that free PDF again. I'm not going to go through the specifics right now. Instead, I want to explain how they work and show you an example of why they're important. So the way they work is that section headings are there to signify distinct sections in your paper. So a level 1 is going to identify a main section. Level 2 would be a subsection to level 1. Level 3 is going to be a subsection to level 2, so on and so forth. Now, to be clear, even though there are 5 levels of section headings, you as a student writing student papers that are not up for publication, you're most likely only going to use a level 1, level 2, maybe a level 3. And if you're using a level 3, it's because it's a very long, complicated paper. Also, do know that section headings are not necessarily a requirement of APA formatting. Your professor might request them. Instead, APA has made them more as a tool you can use, and let me show you why you should be using them. Let me show you an actual example. Okay. On the left-hand side of the screen, this is the assignment we're writing. And so real quickly, let's go through this so you understand it. As you can see, we're being asked to create an analysis of the accounting portions of a business plan using assortment tools presented in the class. Great. We have a list of 4 different criteria, and under each of those criteria, there's some sub-criteria that we're being asked to answer as well. So with that little bit of understanding, here's how I would set up this section headings. Coming over to our paper, I already have the title page set up. We're going to title this Butcher Box Financials. Under APA 7th edition, your title is always going to be the first section heading in your paper. So scrolling down, I've already created these section headings. As you can see, our title is our first one, signifying our introduction. So let's go ahead and talk about the remaining section headings and how we use our instructions to create those. So first things first, notice how the paper is using a combination of level 1 and level 2 section headings. Starting with the level 1 headings, because this is what I recommend setting up first, notice how we have 4 main sections. So 4 sections using level 1 headings. And well, notice how there are 4 main sections in our project criteria. As you can see, the way we labeled the section headings in our paper are reflecting those 4 main sections. For the first one, we have cost-benefit analysis. For the second one, you have your break-even analysis, then your pro forma financial statements, followed by the discussion. This is a really effective way to create the skeleton outline of your paper, in which now we can go back through each main objective to see if there's any sub-criteria or any other distinct sections we're being asked about. So let's take a look at the first one, cost-benefit analysis. Reading through here, what we're being asked to do is outline the advantages and disadvantages of the business to determine if it is a sound investment decision. Great. To do this, we're being asked to perform a SWOT analysis, which you can see here is where you're going to detail the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to that business. So in other words, we have 4 distinct sub-criteria that we need to cover in order to fulfill this objective. So looking at our outline, I'm going to switch to a level 2 heading, and that's exactly what I'm going to include there. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so that's the process you're going to do for each of your main objectives. See if there's any sub-objectives that you want to break into a level 2 heading. When it comes to including your conclusion, you have the option to include it as a level 1, like this. That would make it its own main section. However, for this particular paper, I would include it as a level 2 since our last main section is a discussion. In other words, that discussion is where we're going to analyze and discuss what we've written in the paper. Therefore, the conclusion would just be a nice way to finish out the discussion. Either way is fine. The last thing I want to touch on is why we only used a level 2 heading and when you would use a level 3. So we only went up to a level 2 because that's all we needed. We have our main section and the subsections relevant to that main section. Let's say, for example, in the first objective, in the cost-benefit analysis, we're being asked to give 3 examples of each section in that SWOT analysis. Then I would recommend switching to a level 3 heading. And so let me paste in what this would look like and let me explain because it's going to look a little crazy. Okay, so first things first, notice how I switched my formatting to reflect a level 3. A pro tip is, since I'm including examples, I don't exactly know what those strengths are yet, those weaknesses are, so as a placeholder, I'm just showing that I need to include 3 of each of those. And then now if you're looking at that thinking, man, that just looks like so much work, this is something you would do probably for a much larger paper. So let's say that this was a 25-page paper, not a 10 to 12, then this doesn't look so crazy after all. Instead, it gives you a very specific guide map to follow. It makes it really easy for you to come over to your paper. You know exactly what you need to do each step of the way, and also look at it from your professor's perspective. They're going to look at your paper. They're going to see, oh, they have outlined exactly what the instructions have asked them to do. Now I just need to go through and make sure they answered them fully and adequately. What that would look like on your part is basically you're going to start under the cost-benefit analysis by introducing your paper to the concept of a cost-benefit analysis. Maybe some introductory material about your business that relates to this objective. Then, very similarly, I'm going to do the same thing for the strength portion of a SWOT analysis. What is that? What does that relate to? I'm going to explain that there, which will lead perfectly into me giving example 1, then example 2, then example 3, which that says 2, so let's put that as 3. Great. Concluding this specific part of your cost-benefit analysis. And then from there, you're just going to repeat that for each of those 4 sections. All right, now that we're good on section headings, the next part we're going to move on to is creating citations and references. In order to understand citing and referencing, the first thing we need to talk about is the relationship between these two things, as well as why we do it. So when you're writing an academic paper, that means you're writing a research-based paper. In other words, you're out there researching other people's ideas, thoughts, whatever, and using that in your paper. And so because you're using other people's ideas, you need to credit where they originally came from. If you don't do that, that's when you commit plagiarism, which is essentially academic theft. So how all of this works is, say you're performing research online, you find a journal article that you like, the study fits a point you're trying to make in your paper, and so what you're going to do is you're going to paraphrase the material from that article that's relevant to that point in your paper. Then, because you've used that information from somewhere else, you want to create a full reference list entry at the end of your paper that contains all the citable material that someone would need to relook up that source. Now, in order to link that paraphrased material to that reference list entry, you're going to create a shortened reference, which is called an in-text citation, that you're going to place at the beginning of the paraphrased material. Now that material is linked to the reference list, which is linked to the original source. Okay, so now that we understand why we're creating them, I'm going to cut to a tutorial that's going to go through the basic formatting for citing and referencing.
Now we need to discuss what this looks like in action. So when you're out there writing your paper, what do you actually need to do in order to link these two items together? And yes, note that the document is color coordinated because this is going to help with your understanding, I promise. Okay. The first thing we need to understand is a reference list entry, more specifically, the 4 elements of a reference. So these are the 4 items that you need to include in your reference list entries for it to be considered correct and complete. But what those 4 elements are is the author, the date, the title, and the source. So as you can see in the real life example, you have all of those 4 elements present. Yay, you have properly and adequately cited this source. You've credited the author. But you're not quite done yet, because when you're writing your paper and you include material from another source, you need to make sure you credit them in your paper as you have in your reference list. So this is where the in-text citations come in. And quite frankly, all in-text citations will always have 2 elements present. You have the author and the date. And now, if you're wondering why only those 2 elements and not the 4, first of all, if you included all 4, that would muddy up your paper quite a bit. And number 2, if you have the author and the date, that makes it very easy to go down to the reference list entry and spot which reference that material belongs to, because that's the first 2 items you're going to see. Now, every once in a while, you'll need to include a 3rd element, which is the source locator. And the source locator, if you note, is blue because it corresponds with the source type. So in this example, Para 9, that stands for paragraph 9. So this might be an online article, and they're referring to the paragraph. If it were a YouTube video or a podcast, you'd use the timestamp. But with that, we know how to link these two together. Next, which is already kind of alluded to here, let's discuss the two different types of written material that require a citation. That is paraphrase material and material that is directly quoted. Paraphrase material, this is when you're expressing another author's ideas, but you're writing them in your own words. And quite frankly, this should account for 98% of citable material. In other words, direct quotes should be used sparingly because this is when you're using another person's words verbatim. And verbatim is the key word here because in order to directly quote somebody, you have to leave it as you found it. The words have to stay exactly as they are. Otherwise, you need to paraphrase correctly or you're going to miss some points. All right, the last thing is let's discuss the two delivery options you have for this. In other words, you have a choice on how you format both paraphrase material and directly quoted material. And that is through either a parenthetical or a narrative citation. And the gist is that they're exactly what they sound like. A parenthetical citation is when you enclose the elements for the in-text citation in parentheses, like you see it is here. For a narrative citation, you're simply going to incorporate the elements into the structure of the sentence, generally something as you see it is in this example. You would include the author's last name into the sentence structure, followed by the date enclosed in parentheses. Now, if it's a direct quote, you're going to follow these same principles. However, you're going to be formatting per a direct quote, meaning you're going to include the direct quote in double quotations to signify this. So if this were a parenthetical citation, as you can see, you have that third element, but the rest stays the same. You have the elements enclosed in parentheses at the end of the sentence, and moving down to the narrative citation, the only thing that's different here is that a direct quote that's using a narrative citation, APA asks that you include the source locator at the end of the sentence enclosed in parentheses, simply so it doesn't distract from the structure of the sentence.
Now that you have the foundation understanding for citing and referencing, I'm going to break down each of these topics separately, starting with building reference list entries.
The two things that you need to understand are the 4 elements of an APA reference and then the 2 formatting patterns of those references. So let's start with the first portion, the 4 elements. In other words, these are the building blocks. When you want to cite a source, these are the 4 items you're looking for. What they are is the author, the date, the title, the source. So coming down here, this is what it looks like in a more formal setting. So when you type all of this out, this is just the basics of what it might look. And that is, this is how you're going to include the author by their last name, middle initial, first initial. Then you have the date of publication. Sometimes this is just the year. Maybe you have the day and the month. Maybe you have all 3 items. We'll get to this in the examples. And then by title, we mean title of the work. So what is the journal article called, or the web page called, or even the Facebook post? What's the title of it called? That's what the title of the work is referring to. And then finally, you have the source element. So starting with the source name, that's going to be the name of the website, the name of the journal that the journal article belongs to, the name of the book that you found the information in. And quite frankly, because most of our information is online, there's generally a second part to the source, which is going to be either a DOI number or a URL link. Now, if it's not an online, then you simply only need the name of the source. So when you're citing a source, these are the 4 items you're looking for. Now, this is a good time to note that sometimes the source might be missing some of these elements. So an author may not be listed, or the date of publication may not be listed, for example. Please keep in mind that in order for a source to be a source, you have to have the source element because you need to be able to look it up. So for example, if you're trying to source information from an interview you did, but it's not recorded, it's not written anywhere, well, no one can look it up. Therefore, that's not going to count as a citable source. If anything, that might be a personal communication. Quite frankly, a source can be missing all 3 of the first elements, but as long as you have the location of where you found that material, you can cite it in your paper. But all right, we got one basic concept down. Let's move on to the second one. And that is the two formatting patterns of APA reference. So what that means is that for the thousands of sources that you can be trying to cite, all of them will fall into one of these two categories when you're formatting them. And that is either with an italic title or with an italic source. The criteria for these is that for an italic title, it needs to be a work that stands alone. And for an italic source, it needs to be a work that is part of a greater whole. So now let's see what this actually looks like. Using our template of the 4 elements, note how for works that stand alone, the title of the work is italicized. And for works that are part of a greater whole, the source name is italicized. And quite frankly, if you're wondering what the difference between standing alone and part of a greater whole is, well, you're not alone. It's very common, and this confuses college students. So this is how I like to simplify it. I want you to think of a journal versus a journal article. The journal itself is a standalone source because it doesn't belong to anything else. However, the journal article, because it belongs to the journal, it's a work that's a part of a greater whole. There's actually a list here. This is in the APA manual. You can also find it in that PDF that you can download that I have made for you guys. And so let's zoom all the way out. Okay, so standalone. Think of a full book. Reference works such as encyclopedias, you have government reports, other types of reports, what they call grade literature, something like a brochure, a fact sheet, a press release, ethics codes, dissertation thesis papers. The good news is that if you'll note, most sources are considered standalone. Part of a greater whole, again, falls in line with that journal article mentality. Think of a magazine article, a newspaper, a blog post, an edited book chapter, a TV series episode, podcast episodes. This is the difference when it comes to how you're going to be formatting the source. So these are the two things. If you understand this, you can cite anything. But all right, now we're going to take this information and get into the examples where we're going to see this in action. Okay. These are the first two I want to start with, and that's an example of a work that stands alone versus one that's part of a greater whole. And we're going to zoom in here so you can see all the finer details. And what I really want you to do is pay attention to how the template translates into the actual reference. Because here's the thing, the template, this is the aim you're shooting for. However, when you're out there citing an actual source, you might be missing little pieces and there's going to be different variations. And so I'm going to do my best to explain why the reference is the way it is in regard to the template. All right, so here we have a standard web page with one author. As you can see, for an author element, what APA asks is that you include the author's last name, followed by a comma, their middle initial, a period, ending with their first initial, a period. Coming down here, as you can see, the middle name was not listed, therefore it's omitted from the author element. So for this example, that is considered a complete and correct author element. Finally, I want you to take note that there is a period after the final portion of the author element. Why is this important? It's because this is going to be a common theme throughout all of the elements, and that is that to conclude an element, you want to include a period to signify the conclusion of that element. So as you can see here, all 4 of them can be easily identified if you simply find the periods. All right. Next, we have the date element, which quite frankly, the date element is always going to be the day that this source became a citable source. So in other words, when was the book published? When was the web page posted? When was the podcast episode posted? When was that piece of work officially made a citable source? Now, coming over here to our template, this again is the aim you're shooting for. So if all of this is present, this is what you're going to include. And that is the year followed by a comma, the month, day of publication. So coming down here, we had all of that available to us. We had 2018, a comma, January 2nd. If all that was listed on this webpage was the year, then our date element would simply look like that. But again, we had all of it available to us, so that's what we're going to include. Cool. Moving on to the third element, we have the title of the work. And remember, this is a work that stands alone, so we're going to italicize the title to signify that. Here, this is the example I like to go with because we have a few good points for formatting here. I want you to take note that one, both portions of it is written in sentence case, meaning that the first letter is capitalized. Why is the first letter capitalized in this example? It's because it's broken up with a punctuation. We have the colon here. If there was no colon, then we would simply leave it like this, continuing with the sentence case formatting. But again, we have it there, so we're going to leave it as is because that's the correct formatting for the title of the work in this case. All right, moving on to the source element, we have the website name. And then because this is an online source, we're going to include the URL link. Now, this brings me to a good point. If the entire source element contains both of these, why is the period after the website name and not the URL? Well, the logic is twofold. One, if you include any punctuation, such as a period after a URL link or a DOI number, you're going to break that link. So someone's not going to be able to click on it and actually use it. The other reason is that a URL or DOI is optional. It's not always going to be available to you. And so for a source to be correct, you simply need the name of the source, what it's called. And so we'll see that in other examples. Now, looking at the actual example, couple things I want to note here. One, note how the symbol is used rather than the word and. The reason is because that's how it's presented on the website. You don't want to change that so there's no confusion where the source came. Also, it's capitalized. Why? Because the name of the source is generally more formalized than the title. So things like the Washington Post or the New York Times or the name of a book, the name of a podcast, generally it's going to be capitalized. But as you already know, we have our period to close out the name of the source element here. And then we have our live URL link where I could click this and go find this actual source. Very cool. Now, let's take all of that understanding and let's move on to an example of a source that's part of a greater whole. Let's keep ourselves zoomed in actually. I'm just going to extend this so we can zoom in and see everything nice and neatly. Perfect. All right. As I said, my explanations are going to get a little shorter as we go on. What I want you to pay attention to is that the formatting standards for the different variations remain relatively the same across all different sources. The biggest difference really is rather to italicize the title of the work or the title of the source. As you can see, the templates for both of these look the same. So diving into this actual example, starting with the author element, we can see that we have one author. The middle name was not available to us, so we omitted that from the source. And here we go. Looks just like the one we did in the previous example. Moving on to the second element here, we have the date. Again, all three pieces were available to us, so we formatted it the same way we did with the other source. Now we have the slight variation in formatting. Because this is a magazine article, which belongs to an actual magazine, we're going to leave the title in basic font and italicize the title of the magazine. Aside from that, you're still going to follow sentence case formatting for the title element. In this example, the title is all one phrase. There's no punctuation to break it up. So that's why the F in the first word is capitalized and nothing else. Now, coming over here, we have the title of the magazine, which is Prevention. Easy. We're going to italicize that. And then note how there is a URL link. That's because this is a source we found online. As you can see for this note, if it's a print source, you're going to use the page numbers versus the URL. So let's say I did read this in a hard copy. We're going to use a comma after the title of the magazine and then include the page range as such with the period following after the pages. Why is it okay to use a period after the page range and not the URL? Well, because a period after page ranges isn't going to break the integrity of the page ranges as it would the URL link. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But all right, now we're going to move on to some variations of these other elements, starting with different variations of the author. So let me just scroll down here so you can see what I mean. Because the first thing I want to talk about is when the author is a group author. What that means is that an actual person or people are not responsible for the source. an organization is, maybe a government agency. It's an entity versus a living live person. So taking a look at the template, well, everything else looks exactly the same, except in the author element, we're going to use the name of the group, in this case, an organization, Canadian Cancer Society, instead of a person. Something to note with group authors that's relatively common is that if the group name and the website are the same, then you don't need to include the name of the website in the source element. So in this case, Canadian Cancer Society is the organization responsible for this source. It's also the name of the website this article was found on. So APA asks that you don't include it twice because that's redundant. And with the source element, you're fine because you have the URL link where you can go find the source. Other than that, this is a standalone source. So we're going to italicize the title here and we're good to go. Now, the next author variation we're going to look at is when a source has two authors. And I've actually chosen a journal article for another reason, in that journal articles, the source has just a few extra moving parts than other sources. So this one has two different variations we're going to pay attention to. Starting with the template. This is your aim when you're citing a source that has two authors responsible for that piece of work. Simply put, you're going to use the ampersand symbol to separate the two authors. Both of them, you're aiming for the same information, their last name, middle initial, first initial, if present. As you can see in the example, that's exactly what we have. We have Soto, comma, C, period, J, period, the ampersand sign, John, comma, O, period, P, period. Again, pretty simple stuff. But now, let's talk about the variations of the rest of the elements that are specific to a journal article. First, looking at the date element. APA asks that you only include the year of publication when it comes to a journal article. Why? Well, because with the source, you're going to be including a lot of other information that makes it very specific, that they would rather you leave out the month and the day. So there's not as much information to where it's confusing. As you can see, we have a lot of other numbers and just stuff in this source in general. So to keep it nice and simple, they asked to only include the year of publication. In this example, our journal was published in 2017. And other than that, the rest of the formatting remains the same. Now, moving on to the title of the journal article, well, we know this is a work that's part of a greater whole, therefore we're not going to italicize it. And the rest of the formatting standards remain the same, meaning we're using sentence case, especially if there's a punctuation, we're going to continue sentence case again. So there's no variations in referencing the title of a journal article. It's next in the source element that we're going to see these changes. The good news though, the first portion, the title of the journal, remains the same. Keep it in italic fonts. It's what comes after that where there's just a few extra items you need to include. As you can see here, you need to include the volume number, the issue number, and the page range if available. So let's see what this looks like in translation. All right, title of the journal, we have it here, italic fonts. It's in capital case because the journal article is. Great. Now, because we're not finished with the source element, we're going to include a comma instead of a period. Next, we're going to include the numbers associated with the periodical. What does that mean? Periodical means it's posted periodically. There's more than one. In other words, there's a volume and an issue number that this source belongs to. We're going to start with the volume number, followed by the issue number. And in order to differentiate between the two, we're going to keep the volume number italicized, and then we're going to unitalicize our font and put the issue number in parentheses. So it's crystal clear which is which. In this example, we have a page range. So again, since we're not finished with the source element, we're going to use a comma versus a period, and we're going to include the page range. Very simple. Now that our source element, the first portion anyways, is complete, we will go ahead and include the period to close that. And then we now have our DOI number because that was an online version. And I do want to point out something because I know that seems like a lot of information. It seems like a lot to remember. The good news is in journal articles, especially online journal articles, this information is typically grouped together. You're not going to find the volume number up at the top right-hand corner of one and the issue number down in the bottom. As you can see here, this one actually has the full reference list entry, which a lot do as well. But I just want to point out the source portion. Typically, it's always included together. And if it's not formatted correctly, it's still in that order. They're never going to change that order, so you're always aware which is which. And just to reiterate one more time, if we didn't have a page range available to us, then you don't need to include it. I would include a period after the issue number in this case, followed by the DOI number. But we're going to put this back to how we found it, and we're going to continue on our quest with the author variations. There's 2 more scenarios in specific that we're going to cover, and we're going to keep it with journal articles because they tend to have a lot of authors. The first one is what to do when a source has 3 or more authors, and 3 or more meaning up to the first 19. So this stands true whether you have 3, 5, 18. Okay, simply put, all of the authors leading up to the last 2 are going to be separated by a comma, and then the last 2 are going to use that ampersand symbol once more, signifying that you've reached the last 2. Something I'd like to note when you have multiple authors is the order. Why are they listed the way they are? Well, you're going to list them by contribution to the piece of work. So in other words, the first author listed will always be the one who put in the most work, followed by the second, the third, going down the list until you get to the author that contributed the least amount of work. Looking at our example, we can see our authors using this template. We have, I believe, 7 in this example, but regardless, all of the authors are separated by a comma until you get to the last 2 where you'll find the ampersand. Since the rest of this source follows the exact same formatting we just covered in the previous example, I'm not going to cover the rest of the elements here. Instead, let's focus on what to do if you have 20 or more authors, because again, this does happen and you'll find it mostly with journal articles where lots of people can be contributing to that journal. If you're faced with this situation, what APA would like you to do is include the first 19 authors as you would, followed by an ellipsis, which is 3 periods. Then you're going to skip the rest of the authors until you get to the last and include the last one. So let's say this had 25. Well, I would include the first 19, and then I'm going to include the 25th. This situation is definitely on the rare side, but just know this, you're never going to type out more than 20 authors, even if you have more available to you.
At this point, you should have a pretty good understanding of building references. Now, let's go into this same level of detail with creating in-text citations.
We're going to walk through the most common scenarios regarding the different types of in-text citations. Okay? So here is the most common, and that is a reference entry that has one author. So this is your most standard, what we've seen before, where you would include the author's last name followed by the year that's provided. This is your most basic, simple in-text citation formatting. And I did want to show one more example with that source locator. The rest of the examples won't have them. But let's go ahead, let's graduate to 2 authors. So our full reference list entry, as you can see, we have 2 authors here. For the in-text citation, you're going to include them with the ampersand sign in between the 2 last names as you see it is here. The date element remains the same. This is a good example because I do want to point out that for the narrative citation, you're going to use the word and instead of the ampersand. And the reason for that is that nowhere in your writing is it acceptable to use an ampersand ampersand sign instead of the word anywhere throughout your document when it comes to APA formatting. So this is why they want you to spell it out here. All right, let's go ahead and move on to 3 or more authors. And so in this example, I think we have way more than 3. But I think this is a great example to demonstrate 3 or more because APA formatting has made this very simple for you guys when it comes to the in-text citation. Basically, anytime there's 3 or more authors, you're going to use the abbreviation et al, which literally means and others. I believe in Latin or something like that, but it's going to be formatted exactly like you see I have here. So you're going to use the first author's last name followed by et al and a period because this is an abbreviation. you have your comma and the date element as normal. Do note that et al, there's no capitalization. You want to keep that lowercase so it's not confused with the author's last name. But now let's move on from authors and let's talk about what you need to do if the author element is not a person per se, but a group author. So an organization, a government agency, something in that vein. Basically, what you're going to do is use the organization as the author, because looking at the reference list entry, that is the author element. So in this example, that would be the World Health Organization. So coming down here to our in-text citations, that is what we're going to use in the author element place. Now, you're probably noticing that there's a little bit of variation to this example I want to explain. This first one is what you're going to do if you're only using this source one time. So if I'm just using a few sentences that I've paraphrased, I only need to include this right here. That's perfect. But let's say this is an article or a source that I'm going to use a couple times, or perhaps I mention the World Health Organization later on in my document. What APA would like you to do in this case is the first in-text citation, they want you to type out the full naming and then in brackets, use the abbreviation. So that way, the next time you use the citation, you only have to use the abbreviated shortened version. It just makes your paper look a little less cluttered, neater, so they say. And the narrative citation, as you can see, follows the same formatting standards. Nothing really changes there. But now let's move on to scenarios where an element is missing or even a few less common in-text citation examples. So in this first one, what if the author is unknown, meaning there's no person responsible for the work or a group author? Well, it's quite simple. You want to use the shortened title, or quite frankly, you want to use whatever element is first in your reference list entry. So in this case, you can see the title is APA Citation Guidelines. I do want to point out that in the in-text citation, you want to keep the text italicized. So that way it's crystal clear what this is. In other words, that you are indeed using the title element. And that way the reader can easily match it to the reference list entry. So last thing I want to touch on here is that APA does ask that you use a shortened title, but because the title in this example is already pretty short and concise, you're not going to shorten that any further. But sometimes the title can be quite long. And if it is, you kind of want to just bring it in so you get the gist of it and that it's easily accessible to the reader. I will say unknown authors is fairly uncommon. However, what is significantly more common is a no date scenario. So this is when the reference list does not have a date in this particular entry. And so just as we did in the previous example, you're going to use, well, whatever you have in the reference list entry for the date element. In this case, you're going to use the abbreviated ND uncapitalized with periods. But okay, we have 2 examples left, and these are going to be the less common scenarios, but are still important to know how to do. So in this first one, you're citing more than one study at a time. The scenario here is that you've researched a few different articles, 3 in this example, and they all allude to the same information. So you're researching multiple sources to get a feel for one objective, if you will. And you build a paraphrase that's kind of a combination of all 3. So naturally, you need to cite all 3 of those studies after that paraphrase. And this is simple. All you're going to do is include the 3 citations following formatting standards for their reference list entries, and note they're simply separated by semicolons. So after the date element, you have a semicolon followed by the next citation, a semicolon followed by the final citation. And then the narrative citation, note how it follows the same traditional formatting standards for narrative in-text citations, in that the word and is spelled out. And last quick note about citing more than one study at once, you're probably not going to need any source locators here, because if you're going to directly quote any one of these sources, you probably want to cite that source on its own. Okay, the last example is what do you do if you have two different sources, but the elements for the in-text citation are the same? So the case here is when you have the same author, two completely different works, but they're published in the same year. So this is, again, uncommon, but a very simple, quick fix. What APA would like you to do is use a lowercase letter in your reference list entries to decipher between the two. Therefore, that's exactly what you're going to do in your in-text citation after the date element. So as you can see here, we have A for the first one, B for the second one. So in our in-text citation, that's what we're going to use to decipher between the two different sources. Like I said, this is definitely not a common scenario, but it does happen in certain areas where you have a heavyweight researcher that contributes a lot of information to a particular field.
So at this point, you should be pretty tired of seeing my face, hearing my voice, but on the off chance that you're not, do check out this video next if you want to see how I would actually write an academic paper.